And we're going to pivot to the next section. And for this next session, we are really delighted to be able to have a fireside chat with Kedar Mate, who's shown here. So Kedar is the president and CEO of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which is the preeminent national and international organization that's focused on improving healthcare and has really done tremendous work over decades to really advance this field within our professions. He's also the president of the IHI Lucia Leap Institute. He's a practicing internist. He's faculty at Weill Cornell Medical College. And most importantly of all, he's just a really smart, thoughtful guy who has a ton of experience in this area. And we're really delighted to have his perspective and input today. So welcome, Kedar. So glad to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm sorry we couldn't actually produce a fire that we could sit around, but it's a pleasure to be with you, Mike and Cynthia. Thank you for inviting me to your meeting today and to be with all of you, and just a really warm welcome to everyone. Congratulations also to your investigator group that's won recent awards, and to the colleagues that have won some of the recent grants that you were describing just a few minutes ago. So congrats to everyone.
Wonderful.
Great.
Thanks. So just a brief introduction to how this session is going to run. This is going to last a total of about 45 minutes. And for the first 30 minutes or so, Cynthia and I are going to be asking a series of questions that we've already planned out to Kedar, but please keep those chat questions coming, and that's for two reasons. We'll try to kind of monitor the chat and integrate those things in the questions that Cynthia and I asked during these first 30 minutes, but we're also saving the last 15 minutes purely for audience Q&A. So keep those questions kind of coming throughout, or comments or reflections, and we will try to integrate them both during the initial session, but also very much at the end as well. So with that, Cynthia.
Great. Well, we are just delighted to have you here with us, Kedar. I wondered if you could start by telling us a little bit more about IHI and what some initiatives are ongoing around medication use.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you. And I also just want to say it's amazing to see in the chat how your colleagues are from all over the world. Really, it's really wonderful to have this kind of amazing networks. I love networks like this. IHI, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment, has a sort of an organizing philosophy that which we call all teach, all learn, where everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. And networks like this one is where we nourish one another with our good ideas and our good thinking. And I just love the opportunity to discover from so many of you what the good ideas are that we need to be spreading around the world. So IHI, the institute that I work for and have a chance to lead, has been really for the past, it's 30 years old. This is in fact our 30-year anniversary as an organization. We were founded in '91. And since the beginnings, we have been working on translating quality science methods, methods that were largely pioneered in manufacturing and industry, to some extent in aviation and other sectors, and adapting those methods through an innovation process to make them fit for purpose for healthcare. And then applying them. These change management and quality science methods we've been applying now to healthcare delivery organizations and health systems in over 30 countries around the world, tackling problems and challenges, clinical challenges and operational challenges in healthcare that are very wide ranging, from HIV and tuberculosis care in South Africa, to maternal and child health in Bangladesh, to patient safety concerns, including medication concerns, here in the US and elsewhere in the world. So really a very wide array of types of projects that we get to work on. But what's the thread that connects all of them is the essential quality science and system science method that IHI uses to improve reliability in clinical care and further develops our systems overall.
That's fascinating, and I think so helpful for us to think about as we think about trying to do deprescribing research that will actually, really hopefully inform and change practice. Could you tell us a little bit about the Age-Friendly Health System Initiative and what opportunities you think it provides to understand and improve medication use?
Sure, and there are a lot of experts. I see Amy Berman here is in the chat. So there's a lot of experts in your community on what we've been doing with Age-Friendly. I know Nikki Brandt's close to the leadership here. I saw Sharon Inouye in the chat earlier. So a lot of the folks who helped IHI to really create the notion of an age-friendly health system are here in your network And I would encourage all of you to tap into their wealth of expertise and knowledge. The concept of age-friendly health systems really came from Amy Berman and Terry Fulmer, leaders at the John A. Hartford Foundation, who had for decades observed that we had developed tremendous amount of knowledge around how to improve care for older adults. And yet, when we examined how many older adults, at least here in the US, were experiencing systems of care that were truly age-friendly, we found that a small minority of the total number of older adults in our care systems were getting care that was consistent with best practice evidence standards that were widely available. And so the concept of an age-friendly health system that would truly, as Terry likes to say, start at the kitchen table, go throughout the journey of an older adult that would encounter healthcare in a variety of environments, and then come back to the kitchen table. That total kind of care continuum notion of an age-friendly system was sort of the dream state that that Terry and Amy shared with myself and other colleagues at IHI. And we started to dig into the evidence. So as we tried to articulate what the properties of an age-friendly health system would look like, we started to look at some of the practice models that colleagues like Nikki and Amy and Terry and Sharon had created, practice models, approaches to care of older adults that were highly effective, that were either proven by randomized controlled evidence or had tightly controlled experimental designs. And what we found, much to my surprise, actually, I'm an internist, but I actually wasn't as familiar 5 years ago, 6 years ago when we started this work with the geriatric literature. And to my surprise, we found a tremendous amount of very solid evidence around care standards and what would it take to improve care for older adults. And that was very, very encouraging. It's exactly what IHI looks for as we try to think about how to scale something. We look for high evidence interventions that have yet to scale, that where there's high variability in the care environments around how to take care of individuals. We extracted from the 17 best practice models that we could find, again, work like Sharon's HELP program and others. We extracted some of the properties of what, the active ingredients, as we like to say, of what age-friendly care would look like. And then we invited all of the principal investigators to a meeting in 2016 in the Boston offices of IHI to try to distill out what a case definition would be for an age-friendly health systems from all of that evidence-based practice that we knew was available. And we landed on the 4 M's of age-friendly, which has in it medication. So the 4 M's for reference are what matters to older adults. That's sort of the anchor concept of age-friendly, because without an understanding of what matters to older adults, we really can't do almost anything else in age-friendly. We certainly can't work on medications if we don't know what we're really trying to treat or help improve. And we can't work on mobility, which is the second M, mentation or cognitive issues, including delirium, dementia, and depression. And then, of course, medications was the 4th M. So those 4 kind of key features, there's a set of evidence-based practice changes that surrounded them. We defined those, and then we sought to implement them in care settings across the country, starting first with hospital care, in-hospital care, and then moving into ambulatory care, and now increasingly moving into nursing home environments and post-acute and long-term care settings. And we've been fairly successful at getting widespread adoption of these ideas. So we've moved from what was originally 5 to 10 systems when we were pilot testing these activities, and have now managed to reach over 2,000 care settings across the United States, and have started to seed international. I know there's some international members of the network have started to seed international applications of age-friendly health systems. We just launched an age-friendly Australia effort, and there's one that's burgeoning in the UK at the moment, and other parts of the world. So it's been an exciting journey around this. And medications, as I mentioned, is at the heart of it. And the way that we approach medications, for the sake of conversation, is that we defined 7 classes of medications, none of which will be terribly surprising to you, that had higher rates of risk among older adults. And we discovered, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of synergy amongst the 4 M's, because, of course, diminishing exposure to benzodiazepines and opiates had an impact for older adults, had an impact on mobility and mentation, and of course, what matters to folks. So we started to see relationship between the 4 M's, which I think has been so important about how it works.
Fabulous. That's a really, I mean, some really important points there. I want to maybe sort of reflect on something that when we first met and we were sort of talking about setting up this session, we were talking a little bit about sort of the differences in getting a health system to start a new behavior versus de-implement or stop a behavior that they had been doing. So, and this of course relates to medications and deprescribing. So I'm curious if you can kind of reflect some on what you have learned from trying to get health systems to de-implement a process and how the competencies for that might differ from something where we wanted to get them to start something new. Or is that a false dichotomy?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we do the essence of quality improvement and what we are working on at IHI is change management, essentially how to help health systems adopt new ideas, adopt new changes. In the case of age-friendly, it's adopt those 4 M's and make them reliably practiced in every care setting across the planet. Right? That's the ambition. It's at its core, at its essence, it's change management. And one of the things that the behavioral economics literature has taught us is that when you're working on change management, there's this concept of loss aversion, which is a very powerful and deep-seated perspective. It was first described in the late 70s, I believe 79 or 80, in a paper that Kahneman and Tversky wrote about where they coined the term loss aversion, where it was first described. And it was interesting because what they described was their research and subsequent researchers demonstrated that losses are essentially twice as powerful as an equivalent gain. A way of illustrating that it's better not to lose $40 than it is to find $20 in terms of how we motivate people. So literally, that's sort of they've done empiric studies where they asked people how much they were willing to lose versus what they would gain in return, and the ratio is roughly 2 to 1. And so it's a very powerful concept. It is often stronger for those with less power, wealth, prestige, where they have more to lose. Not terribly surprising on some level. So and we see it play out all the time. And I think Michael, when we spoke, I told you about my 99-year-old grandfather who is still on a statin and vitamins, and it takes a whole lot of medications for which I know, and he in some ways knows are of relatively marginal benefit to him at this point in time, but it's very difficult for him to give them up. He doesn't want to stop taking them because it registers to him as a loss. It registers to him as something that he has to give up rather than the gain that he could get out of being free from those medications on some level. When we think about how to manage loss aversion, which might be important for this audience to consider, how we consider de-implementing things or how we consider changing practice when loss aversion is a factor, I think of 2 things that kind of matter a lot here. One is to reframe the loss as a gain. Again, if I go back to my grandfather's example, helping him to realize or understand that the loss of the medications that he doesn't really need anymore is in some way some kind of advantage for him. It's actually releasing him from the side effects potentially of those medicines that he might otherwise experience. So trying to reframe this as a gain. The second area is about sort of developing new habits. And we know from the human factors literature that we have to, whenever we're talking about adopting a new practice, we have to demonstrably show that new practice has advantages over the old practice, whatever it might be. So we have to show that by not taking the medicines, in this case, that there's some advantageous phenomenon that my grandfather can now experience, or your patients can now experience, that outweighs the perceived benefit of the current process. So and as we consider how to build new process, is the new process compatible with our values? Is it compatible with our life experience? Is it valuable to the potential adopter? Is it simple enough for them to follow, or is it complex? Are we replacing a more complex process with a simpler process? Is it relatively easy to complete? And can you try it out? The sort of notion of observability and trialability is essential to getting new processes embedded in the first place. So just some tactics to use as we try to overcome the challenge of loss aversion which I think is really important for, I predict for folks that are working on deprescribing.
I'm curious, are there any sort of analogies that you've seen in your other work, might be in a different field entirely, where you've kind of come across this issue of, of loss aversion and de-implementation that might sort of draw a parallel with what we're trying to do here, whether it be TB or anything else?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to a criminal justice reformer this morning, and I don't know if this is exactly an analogy, but it's what's coming to mind because it's sort of top of mind as I was talking to this gentleman this morning who leads a criminal justice reform agency and organization. And I think, in some ways, the approach to how we police is being reframed right now. And not to get political about this topic, because I know that there's a lot of strong feelings about this on either side. But I think there is a bit of reframing that's happening right now. And there is loss aversion associated with any kind of movement of money away from police and public safety investments towards, for example, behavioral and mental health services, which might be, in some cases, potentially primary preventative activities that would prevent people from landing in the criminal justice system in some way. But that takes a big reframe that folks are probably somewhat challenged to do, because there's a perceived risk of doing so if you move money out of police department budgets and into behavioral health budgets at a city level or a state level. But that is exactly what's happening. I mean, in the city of Boston, where IHI is based, and in Austin, Texas, in parts of Southern California and Los Angeles, that's exactly what people are trying to do right now, is to move money out of traditional public safety measures and into behavioral health and healthcare, actually into health primary prevention kind of activities, and into stable housing. That's another area that people are investing in. But trying to think about analogies here of what, there is this sort of popular or public loss aversion concern. I think that would be present in any kind of move like that, which is deeply connected to political issues as well. I think sorry to riff on this point a little bit further, but the one other thing I just want to say is that I think we often in healthcare, but just in change management in general, we often regard resistance as a problem. When our patients are resistant, when my grandfather is resistant to change, and the more vehement the resistance, in some ways, the more concerned we become, or as clinicians and providers, we might become a little less likely to push the change if we are encountering resistance. I can remember in my clinic having a patient I was working with who had congestive heart failure, and I knew I had to change his diuretic regimen, and I knew I was going to get grief about it from him because of the issues around urinating at various times of the day and not wanting to do that, and just being like uncomfortable about that. And of course, that resistance made me nervous as a practitioner, as a provider, that I was going to encounter that resistance. And I knew, whenever he was in my schedule and we were going to have to make some adjustments, I could feel myself almost steeling myself for that encounter. And I think that's a pretty common, very visceral kind of response to resistance. And yet there's something that we've done at IHI, which over time, it's a learned behavior over time, which is to recognize that resistance is actually engagement. Resistance to whatever the change is that you're trying to bring forward is not bad. In fact, it's desirable in a sense, because it testifies to either an individual or a system actor or an institution being deeply engaged with the problem you're trying to address. And you can actually change resistance over time into an asset. And so just an example of that is, I remember when we were working first on ICU safety in Scotland, the head of the Critical Care Society was an incredible resistor and was very happy to say so about some of the changes that we were trying to bring into ICU practice at the time in Scotland, and voiced his resistance, his issue with us in a very public set of forums, trying to stop the process of conducting a national safety initiative in intensive care units across the country. And we recognized that resistance as being engagement. This was actually a very passionate advocate for critical care. And over time, after exposing the evidence, doing tri-level tests of change, as I mentioned earlier, and demonstrating that the new process and the new approach to safety was going to be superior to the old, he became our biggest advocate and champion for the change that we were working on in the ICUs in the country, and actually became the national director of the ICU Collaborative 2 years later. So just an example of how resistance can be engaged.
There's a lot of people in the chat that really love that way of reframing things. I think that really people that really spoke to people. So thank you. So I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. Practice-based research networks have been used to tackle other thorny problems in medicine and facilitate research that can really be translated into clinical practice. And we'd love to hear your thoughts about how these networks operate. What's your experience working with them? And obviously, we're all thinking about how do people who are interested in research around deprescribing, work productively and think about those as an opportunity.
Yeah, so practice-based research networks, I don't know the genesis of this idea. It's been around for probably about a decade, maybe a little bit longer than that. Maybe I don't exactly know. It's often driven by, just for definitional purposes for a second, there are research activities that are conducted in situ, in practice environments, and practice environments, because they typically see a relatively small n of whatever it is, they need to be joined together into networks to develop sufficient numbers that allow formal research activities to take place on the chassis of a practice-based network of some kind. Typically, data flow out of the encounter through either automated channels or through manual data entry into a repository, some kind of an archive of data. And then that data is used both for quality improvement purposes to improve practice standards within each of the individual locations, and to conduct formal research activities, to try to guide the clinical practice environments to superior performance in whatever the area is. Some of the best practice PBRNs or practice-based research networks are often in pediatrics, because the issue of small n is very, very common in pediatrics. And so I think thank you, Michael, for helping to clarify a bit of the history there. But it's a very important. It's a lot older than I understood. But thank you for that. But so this is a very it's, I think, a very powerful construct of building common data assets that people can then use for multiple purposes. Some recent, I think, important innovation in PBRNs has been the inclusion of patients as another layer of network activity. So you've got the clinicians who are conducting clinical practice that speak to each other about practice norms and behaviors and change patterns. You've got a research community that's studying the work of those practices to try to understand how to accelerate performance in a variety of areas. And then you have a patient community often that's intended to drive the research agenda as well as to support the practitioners to create new knowledge. And I think this type of network, these types of networks, as we were talking in the prep time, Michael and Cynthia, it struck me that this kind of network would be potentially very relevant for an international movement like this one, where again, individually we might deprescribe for dozens, perhaps hundreds of patients, but to get sufficient N to create large-scale sort of studies of what we do around what works for deprescribing, it might benefit from some kind of a wider network of collaborating partner institutions with a shared set of data standards that to generate the kind of data that would be worth having.
Very cool. Maybe on a related topic, and this can relate to PBRNs as well as anything else. I'm curious, like from your experience, what have you seen are the biggest mistakes, but also the biggest successes that researchers have sort of commonly made in trying to get their research to lead to real world change?
Yeah, the biggest challenge that we often see is that the requirements for a very successful study are the very same things that make it very dissimilar from real life. And so the findings that we have become very difficult to translate into real world practice. So we create tightly controlled environments with inclusion and exclusion criteria that are sometimes fairly robust. And then when we go to apply that in a real world environment where people don't really match those inclusion exclusion criteria, or where the conditions don't really match every day, the findings are less robust. And that's not terribly surprising because of the design, because of what I just described. There's too big a separation between the work, the investigation environment and what is really happening in our clinical environments, which in part the PBRNs are trying to resolve, right? They're trying to create, research activity in practice environments that are, closer to real world application. I think the other big thing that PBRNs are trying to close the gap on is a separation between the research community and the practice community. Fundamentally, trying to get that kind of rapid translation between the two is incredibly important, because otherwise we architect this problem of dissemination, for which there is now a new science, a new field of dissemination science, which is being created principally to overcome a design flaw in how we conduct research activity, right? Because we conduct research activity over here, and then we have the practicing community over here. And so therefore we need some kind of dissemination field that helps us bridge these two communities instead of having them interwoven and combined a priori, obviating the need for a dissemination, for a formal notion of dissemination science. One example of how this has worked in real life is from one of these networks that we've been involved with, which works on children with a congenital heart issue called hypoplastic heart syndrome. They require 2 surgeries in the first year of life to fix the congenital malformation of the heart. The inter-surgical mortality between the 2 surgeries is very, very high. And there was a learning health network, a network that was created around patients, again, very small n. These are congenital heart anomalies. There are not very many sites that treat these, about 25, 30 sites that treat these across the United States. They put all of those practice sites together. They all flowed their data into a common data repository, and they started understanding. Prior to the PBRN being set up, the Learning Health Network being set up, they had made a discovery in 2010 that ACE inhibitors, which they'd been giving to these children, had 0 effect on mortality, no effect on mortality. 6 years later, after that discovery was made, 40% of these children were still on ACE inhibitors, which was the number of people that were on them when the discovery was made. So you can tell that the dissemination science was not particularly effective. This is before the PBRN was set up, before the Learning Health Network was set up. Once the Learning Health Network was set up in 2014, 15, somewhere in that neighborhood, they started looking at the data that was flowing in now from all the 30 practice sites that were conducting that were treating these patients. And they made an observation that patients on digitalis for other reasons, not necessarily to prevent morbidity or mortality, but if they were on digitalis for whatever constellation of reasons, the intra-surgical mortality went up. I'm sorry, intra-surgical mortality went down, by a very significant proportion. They made that discovery, and within 16 months, 80%, it went from 5 to 10% of the patient population being on this medication to 80% of patients being on the medication within 60 months. And they had, in the meantime, conducted a prospective analysis. So they made that observational, they observed that in the data, then they studied it prospectively for 6 months, saw this dramatic effect size, and then they expanded it to the whole network, and 80% of kids were on the medicine within 16 to 18 months. That's the power, I think, of the kind of network that I'm describing, where practice and research are deeply intertwined. And are not sort of separate things for which we need a bridging field of dissemination science. No offense to those of you that are dissemination scientists on the line, but I think we're sort of solving, we're band-aiding a problem when the original design I feel is flawed.
Yeah, interesting. I just want to ask one follow-up there. So one of the things that really struck me, we had a fabulous keynote speaker last year, was Kara Tannenbaum, and she sort of made a really insightful point that deprescribing is just fundamentally a problem of behavior change. And some of the examples you've been talking about here with ACE inhibitors and digitalis, they're we all need to be prescribing specific medication, which is, a fairly sort of standard intervention across different sites. And of course, behavior change is going to be widely varying depending on the local context. So I'm curious, if you've seen PBRNs or other sort of collaborative activities, how can you sort of what are some of the best strategies for identifying these behavior change modalities that might work in one site and then sort of trying to get them to apply to a whole bunch of different heterogeneous environments?
I think this is the benefit of having your practice community and your research community deeply intertwined, right? Where, and there's a fair amount of chat in here about existing PBRNs and Deprescribing that are available or out there right now, which I think is very compelling and probably worth investigating further. But I think there's, to the advantage of the concept of a PBRN is you can have a multifactorial experiment available depending on the size of the network. But you can have, a site that's pursuing, for example, a particular change management strategy to the behavior change that you're trying to produce in various combinations. If you identify a dozen factors that might be relevant, you can have sites sort of utilizing them in different combinations and on different patient populations and on different medication categories. And with a sufficiently large enough size PBRN, you can tease out which factors are most relevant in which practice settings for which populations and for which medications, which I think would be a very powerful potential application of a PBRN structure for the condition or issue that we're talking about here around the PBRN.
Great. So this was actually a question we had for you, and I also see it mirrored in this in the chat, Kedar. But we'd love to hear what your experience at AHI has taught you about engaging older adults, their care partners, and sustaining their involvement in, really moving a research, creating and then moving forward a research agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. For our work on age-friendly health systems, just as an example, we've and for almost all of our projects that we do at IHI, there's always a, who is the benefit? There's a question of who's the beneficiary, who will benefit from this intervention if we are successful. And actually asking that question recently, as opposed to kind of how we answered that question even 5 years ago, has changed over time because we've become a lot more sensitive to the who benefits from the intervention in a more comprehensive way as we turn our attention to inequities that are present in our systems and in our society. So we've become a lot more aware, I think, of the fact that in many cases, what we end up doing is improving median performance of a system when in fact much of that benefit accrues to the whoever the advantaged population is already in the community or in that environment. We've seen that time and again. But as we've now worked on with much more intentionality to try to understand who the beneficiaries are, we usually put those beneficiaries into some kind of patient community advisory group. Age-Friendly has one, of course, and that group then teaches us about what matters to them as we conduct. So this is sort of like the meta what matters, if you will, to the whole initiative. So what matters is not only a component of what we focus on trying to create better clinical interactions for every older adult in every care encounter, but it's also a meta design feature of the Age-Friendly Health Systems initiative as a whole, which is to consider what matters as a fundamental design principle of how you build your intervention strategy or your research plan, whatever it may be. And I think, again, increasingly, I noted that in your grant applications, there's a question about patient involvement, and many of the applicants have plans, I suspect, to interview and engage patients in the development of their strategy, their intervention strategy. And I think that is absolutely essential to thinking about how to develop a patient-powered research agenda, as it were. I also think there's a different way of engaging patients that's not just about providing advice to us as investigators or us as practitioners, but rather to each other. Again, in some of the most mature versions of learning health networks or PBRNs, you see this sort of community of patients speaking to each other about what matters to them and how to solve for some of the kind of lived experience challenges of either migrating off a particular medication regimen or indeed taking on a new therapeutic decision, or just frankly living with the disease or condition that they have and all the circumstances that it might create. One example that I like to use about this is from a network that was set up around inflammatory bowel disease, and there were a bunch of kids in this network that had colostomies because they'd had multiple colon resections and had a permanently now had colostomies in their abdominal walls. And these children, or these kids, they're teenagers. No, they're not kids. I guess they're teenagers. They were trying to help their colleagues navigate life of being a teenager living with a colostomy bag. How do you date? How do you go to the prom? How do you have a relationship with when you have this kind of major life-altering event occur where you now need to have externalize your your fecal matter through a colostomy? That's not an easy thing to navigate. And while clinicians might have guidance around that, or researchers might have guidance around that, there's nothing like the advice of another teenager who's gone to the prom and tried to figure out how to wear a prom dress or suit with a colostomy bag. So that kind of knowledge, I guess I would go beyond the notion of engaging consumers and patients for our research agenda, which feels a bit self-serving, but rather think about engagement of patients and consumers or family members or caregivers for a much wider objective of helping the patients fundamentally manage their condition more effectively, which is, I might argue that figuring out how to go to prom with a colostomy is probably just as important as the anti-inflammatory medications, the biologics that they're taking and have to take to manage their condition more effectively.
A great point. I want to sort of pivot from there to a question that's been circulating in the chat, and that Sean Hennessy raised, some other people have been commenting on, and that is for many other studies, people are like satisfied with process outcomes. You give a drug, the lipid levels go down, you call it a success. But for deprescribing studies, a lot of times people will sort of demand on seeing actual improvement in clinical outcomes, not just a non-inferiority. And so this can lead to the problem. You need to recruit huge ends to be able to show that. So I'm curious if you can sort of reflect on how investigators in the field can sort of do studies when there is this push to demonstrating definitive clinical benefit from deprescribing, which, as you know, can take millions of dollars and many years to achieve, and where we don't readily have those funds available all the time.
Yeah,
and show value for health systems leaders so they want to invest in these interventions.
So those are two different questions that have kind of not divergent responses, but different answers. So the question of how do you demonstrate clinical benefit versus how do you demonstrate system benefit, because the outcome of interest for the system is very different than the outcome of interest at the patient level. At the clinical level or the patient level, the outcome of interest, broadly speaking, often is a clinical outcome, right? The enalapril thing, the ACE inhibitor with the kids with hypoplastic heart syndrome versus digitalis, right? It's a clinical benefit. You survive more. In that case, it's a relatively short window. It happens within a year, and you can demonstrate it pretty robustly within a short period of time. For the system level, the benefit is not necessarily purely clinical. The system benefit is typically financial. There's a financial question and there's a cost question. And a lot of the value or interest in at the provider level, at the system level, at the payer level, in deprescribing activities will be cost-related concerns and the opportunity to improve those. That will be the outcome of interest, I think, at the system level. Again, I'm not an expert in deprescribing, so forgive me if some of what I'm saying here is not completely accurate. But my prediction, at least what I hear and what we experience interest from colleagues around at the system level, is that the interest is not a pure clinical interest. It's a cost-related interest in the deprescribing interventions that are part of the 4 M's of age-friendly. As I think about how you get to answer your question now in 2 parts, on the first part about clinical outcomes that matter, cardiology did this brilliantly by saying what's the third. I mean, when they talk about when they worked on door to balloon time, just as an example, they picked a 30-day endpoint. They defined some endpoint, and it was mortality around, because they could demonstrably show a benefit to mortality within that window, which of course is really optimal. I don't know whether for every drug category that we're talking about and every patient population, there'll probably be a very wide range of potential clinical outcomes, but try to define a window of an outcome that can be experienced within a window of time that is clinical in nature. And again, the value, not to reiterate this point, but the value of something like a PDRN is that you generate much greater N. And so that you can combine your patient populations across a wider array of environments that creates a more robust demonstrable effect, is a bigger N. So you've got a large number, potentially a much larger number of people that are involved in your study. And it's robust across a variety of environments, right? Because you're conducting research across environments like the Northeast and the South and in Belgium, as I saw in the chat as well. So you create, validity or it's robustly designed, as we like to say. So that's part of my answer, probably an incomplete one, around how to generate outcomes, clinical outcomes more effectively or in shorter order. The cost question is a harder one. And I think one of the risk points, and something I really wanted to say to this audience, is that one of the challenges I think that you all have is that the empirical estimates of deprescribing that I've seen suggest that some of the drug categories that we intend to target, the common things like the non-specialty drugs, statins, antihypertensives, some pain controllers, et cetera, they don't tend, that are the targets often for deprescribing, they don't tend to save a ton of money, either to the system or to the patient. So the copays are usually low for these things because most of them are generically available, or many of them are generically available or substituted with generics. And they don't save the system a tremendous amount of money either. The second issue is that any concern about what might look, smell, or mirror something that seems like rationing, which this might look or smell like, will run into significant policy hurdles, both formal policy hurdles in DC or your corresponding government, and or with health system leadership that's not really interested in any kind of rationing type endeavor. So I think the question that, as a community, you all might, as you're thinking about this cost question and what will matter to system administrators, you've got to go for where there may be more cost impact, and that is in your specialty medications and in your brand name drugs. And so figuring out how you mitigate the impact of those overall would be a higher or more enriched target environment, I think, for getting the system leadership to really pay attention and care. Also, I would think a lot about, and I don't know if this fits within the deprescribing framework formally, but changing the location of where a drug is prescribed has a big impact on the total cost of that drug. So the obvious examples are infusion centers and infusion-related medications. But shifting that to a non-hospital-based care environment changes the pricing structure and the total cost of that substantially, and may continue to change the pricing around that in the future. So, whether that's fits within the realm of deprescribing, because you're not formally stopping necessarily the use of those medications, or whether it's more in the realm of changing prescribing overall that might have a substantial economic impact. That's where you're going to get more traction with administrative leadership in a health system, or indeed with policymakers down the line.
Great. I have another question for the chat from you, which you've touched on a little bit, Dr. Mate. Dr. Mogi, I hope I got that right, said that he's familiar with the 4 M's of the age-friendly health systems, and wondered if you can cite examples of its implementation in accountable care organizations where payers like insurances and Medicare are providing increased incentives, to achieve marks. Since the ACOs want to reduce total costs of care, shouldn't deprescribing be one of the strategies, given how many of the metrics actually end up pushing people towards getting more meds? And I think it relates to some of the things you were just talking about, but would be good to hear you reflect on it.
Yeah, again, insofar as the medications themselves cost, or the medications themselves, including the ones that we focus on in the 4 M's of age friendly, are in this category of non-expensive, generally speaking, not very expensive, not very high cost medications. And so you're not generating very significant economic impact in value-based payment arrangements that ACOs or APMs will have. What you can generate an argument around is if those avoiding those medications like benzos and antipsychotics and pain medicines like opiates, etc. If those medications then cause less delirium, which they do, or cause fewer falls, which they often do, or by deprescribing them, you shorten the length of stay of an individual, which they sometimes do. Those are the kinds of arguments that start to resonate more or start to generate economic value or impact in our estimations. So we did for age-friendly, and on the website, which we can chat in here eventually, there's a set of economic calculators or set of ROI calculators that we published with the help of some professors at UCLA that helped us create these calculators for a global payment or capitated environment versus a pure fee-for-service environment. So we tried to, knowing that people would be in different kinds of arrangements, we tried to estimate the relative, or have calculators that were fit for both purposes. And again, a lot of the value improvement that we saw as a result of implementing age-friendly within those alternate payment model type environments, value-based care environments, had a lot to do with whether or not we were avoiding those kinds of complications that were associated with the medications that we were trying to have deprescribed. So you're not getting value necessarily. You're not getting a big economic impact out of the cost of the medicines. You're getting the economic impact out of the consequences of those medications no longer being in the body, and the other effects, side effects, and adverse effects that they might create for the individual.
And maybe one final follow-up question on that before we head into the break. So we're talking about sort of the economic model, but of course, systems are interested in patient satisfaction because that helps them, enroll members and improve the bottom line ultimately. So I'm curious to what extent you've seen sort of patient satisfaction metrics, which often, are sensitive to deprescribing interventions. Those have been used by health systems to actually embrace interventions like these.
Patient satisfaction measures are widely used. In fact, I was talking with colleagues at the American Board of Internal Medicine yesterday about their trust initiative. And one of the few proxy measures for trust is whether or not which are widely used, are CAP scores and satisfaction scores and experience scores, if you will, of the system. I don't know the proximal relationship between a deprescribing intervention. So much of what we'll see, and I predict, is what constitutes a percentage point increase or decrease in a satisfaction score is likely to be very multifactorial. Some part of it might be associated with the deprescribing move that a clinician and a patient have a conversation around, but a lot of it will be a whole lot of other things. Frankly, going back to the what matters question, whether the clinician simply asked the patient what matters to them and sat down at eye level and had that conversation with them directly is likely to have a bigger impact. When we look at the 4Ms, we don't try to tease these apart from each other when we look at net impact of the 4Ms. And so I don't know that you'll ever be able to isolate the impact of the deprescribing intervention on something as something like patient satisfaction overall. But they are very widespread and widely used measures at this point in time, which is convenient if you're trying to understand the effect of a deprescribing intervention in an environment. But your challenge will be, I think, teasing out the relative contribution of the deprescribing activity from the myriad other things that are happening in the system and between the patient and clinician.
Well, I'm bummed because I feel like I want to talk all day, but we're actually at the end of our session. So thank you, Kedar, for fabulous sort of insights, and really appreciate your joining us and providing all the wisdom that you have.
I'm happy to do it. If I may just say one thing about something I saw in the chat a minute ago. I can't find it anymore, but it was a question about how to make the easy thing to do the right thing to do, or a suggestion about that. I think that is something that I just want to emphasize here at the end, which is there's something about deprescribing and how we do it, and just prescribing in general, which we have to think about a lot. I think as we think about human factors work, this notion of making the right thing to do the default thing to do seems so powerful as a change idea and concept. But thank you for having me here. I look forward to learning more from the network. And your list, there's a lot of translators. I saw Donna Fick in the chat, and I know I saw Amy earlier, and Sharon and Nikki, of course, and so many colleagues here from the Age Friendly Initiative. What I'd love to leave you with is your discoveries, which we rely on at IHI. We rely on the wisdom of research communities like this one to produce good evidence that we can then help bring out to the wider environment and community. But there's a lot of translators here on the line and in your network, and we would love to hear from you as you make those discoveries, so that we can bring or integrate your findings into what we think of as the model for an age-friendly health system.
Great, super. Thank you so much.